Hey, deserving listeners. So I sent a survey out to y'all asking you about your opinions about Love is Blind Season 6. And so I thought I would present those results to you now. Keep in mind that I'm recording this about a week after the reunion aired. So if anything has happened past this point in the news, like if something is discovered, this video wouldn't reflect that, and of course the results of the survey wouldn't reflect that. But I asked, who did you like? And I listed all of the cast, including some of the random people that didn't make it out of the pods, meaning that they didn't get engaged. It's not like they're stuck in the pods for the rest of their life. Wouldn't that be interesting? I feel like in a dystopian future that would be. I watched Running Man the other night. It's kind of related. So on the survey, I listed all the names and I asked if you liked that person, and you could check as many people as you wanted to. Guess in your mind who was the most liked person out of 15 people that were on the list. I'm guessing a lot of you would imagine that it's Amy, because a lot of people liked Amy. What could you possibly dislike about Amy? And including in terms of the edit anyway, with 86% of the people who filled out the survey indicating that they liked Amy, which makes you wonder what's going on with that 14%. Or maybe people are just like, yeah, she's fine, but I wouldn't say I particularly like her. I don't know. Then AD was a close second, Johnny was a close third, and Brittany was a close fourth. So nearly everybody liked Amy and AD and Johnny and Brittany. Then there's a fairly big gap to the next group of people. You had Clay, who is number fifth, the fifth most liked person among y'all, but only getting 43% of y'all to say that you liked Clay. But still, it's interesting. I think that's a little surprising to me. And then number 6 is Amber, which makes sense given that I think she came off pretty well. We, of course, didn't get to see her after the pods, so God knows. I'll remind everyone that Trevor, I think, was the most or one of the most liked people on the survey that I sent out to y'all after the episode 6. So I think that's like during the getaways. Anyway, so Amber was 6th. Jess is next, then Jimmy, then Kenneth, then Chelsea. Then we go down to Laura, who only had 21% of y'all say that you liked her, but still, it's still something. Then Trevor, Sarah, Matthew, and then Jeremy. I find that kind of interesting that Trevor was more liked, not by very many people, but more liked than Sarah, Matthew, and Jeremy. Jeremy makes sense, but I thought more people would like Matthew. And in the next episode, I'm going to have my final thoughts, and I'm going to discuss in more detail what likely was going on with Matthew, and it's a much more sympathetic view. I can't know, of course, but I'm going to get into that later. And so that's that list. So again, Amy, AD, Johnny, Brittany, then down a notch, Clay, Amber, Jessica, Jimmy, Kenneth, Chelsea. I feel like Chelsea should get a higher mark than that, but what are you going to do? And also Kenneth. It seems like Kenneth. So only about a fourth of y'all liked Kenneth. I mean, it doesn't mean that you disliked him. I'll get to the dislikes in a second. And then Trevor, Sarah, Matthew, Jeremy. Or Laura, Trevor's. I'm not really surprised by that. Then disliked. The most disliked person, of course, if we just looked at the most liked list and flipped it on its head, we have Jeremy was 79% saying they disliked him, but still, 21% indicated that they didn't dislike him. Matthew is second with 77%. Then Sarah. You have Jeremy being the number one most disliked person, and I think I would say, given the edit, and there's a fair amount of data there, I think that is fair. Now, what do we do with our dislike? I would hope that you have heard me say many times that it is not okay. I would heavily dislike it if anybody, including yourself, were to attack these individuals directly, or even on public forums, because they might come across it. At the very least, you can word things in a way considering that this is a human being, right? And you can point out your thoughts, you can criticize, you can provide your conceptualizations, but I just hope that people are, at the very least, tentative, and at best, just don't say things that you would imagine might really harm individuals. I'm sure none of you do that. I'm not going to give my likes or dislikes, really, because I don't really see it that way. Maybe the question for me would be, who would I guess I would be friends with and get along with well enough to be friends with them? Well, that's even a different question, because some people I would like, but I would say, I don't think we have a lot in common. Well, what I'll say is I have no idea. There's a chance that Sarah Ann and I would be I have friends, people that are close to me, people whom I love, that have massive problems with their personalities and their behaviors. And yet I still love them and like spending time with them. And I'll point out that I think that they have issues, and I suppose they point out when I have issues as well. Not that I'm perfect by any means, but there are people with traumas, with maturity that's left to be developed, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to dislike them or not want to be friends with them. Overall, though, I would say that the sort of people that get disliked on these shows would not be the sort of people that I would hang with all the time. But, if you know Umberto, for example, God knows how he would come across, or even just myself, but particularly Umberto, God knows how he would come across on Love is Blind. I could see it going either way. I could see people loving him, like Amy, and I could see people hating him. Even kind of like Jeremy. If you've heard some of the things that Umberto says sometimes, he'll dig in, and sometimes I'll edit out stuff, or I'll try to save him on the podcast. And he's no Jeremy. Umberto has a ton of compassion and empathy and care, but he also has issues that we've gone over, and I could see that rubbing a lot of people wrong, and yet Umberto is my best friend. So I guess I should have thought about that. I did a lot of prep for this up. Usually I just sort of riff, but I actually spent a lot of time, a lot of hours going over the survey and picking out different things and giving it some thought, and also for my final thoughts. But anyway, I didn't think about this, so I'm thinking about it on the fly, and what I would say is, who do I like? Clay jumps out at me, and that might have been apparent by the way I was reacting. I think that I can relate to him. Definitely a familiarity with Clay. I feel like I've had a lot of clients like him, black male clients like him. I've also had a lot of friends who were like him, and I guess I understand where they're coming from, and I understand how they got here, and I don't necessarily relate in my own life. I relate to the toxic masculinity aspects of it, for sure. Am I saying sure wrong? Sure weird? For sure? For sure? Anyway, for sure. Gag me with a spoon. Kenneth seems like a good enough guy. We didn't see a lot of him, but I could see hanging with him as long as he wasn't on his phone all the time. That does bug me when people do that. Chelsea seems like the sort of person that I'd be able to hang with as well. Jimmy, Amy, Johnny, AD, of course. And with Brittany, how do I say this? I don't know if it's the pageant. I looked a lot of their Instagrams. I don't know if it was the pageant thing. And, I'm not saying anything bad about pageant people. I have people in my life who were in pageants in high school. I was in a pageant in college. When I think about it, the Greek system, I was in a fraternity, and I was chosen by the fraternity to represent our fraternity in this pageant called Mr. Greek. It's so funny that I was in a pageant. I didn't take it that seriously, and it wasn't a very serious event. There was no prep. It was very low-key. I didn't make it even to the second round. I was in a pageant. So I'm not saying it's that. I don't know. There just seemed to be some individuals on this cast where I just wonder if they would even want to hang out with me. Sarah and Laura also kind of seem in that category. With Amber, hard to say with Amber, we didn't see much. Jessica, yeah, I could see Jessica. She seems pretty differentiated and balanced and interesting. Trevor, hard to say with him. I could see it going either way. If in person he is genuine with issues, then yeah, I have one friend in particular that's very much like that version of Trevor, if we imagine. Not a psychopath, not a manipulator, not an abusive person. There's another chance that Trevor is a highly problematic individual. I think most people assume that he is. If it's that, then yeah, no. But there are people who have really difficult lives and have developed some what Trevor, I think, would call very toxic reactivities and relationship styles. And when they tell you their relationship history, you'll just hear just a long story of many, many highly conflictual, difficult relationships. And yet they're still good people. They still have empathy. They still have compassion. They just have a lot of relational traumas that play out through projective identification in relationships. And Trevor could be one of those people. Hard to say. Matthew and Jeremy, hard to know. I would guess not. Okay, moving on. The third question I asked, so I asked among the 15 cast members, who do you like, who do you dislike? I also asked, who do you think insincerely got engaged to stay on the show? The number one person was Jeremy with only 53%, but it's significant. 53% of y'all thought that Jeremy got engaged insincerely. But that means, there's a lot of people that thought that he went on the show in all likelihood in a sincere manner. Clay got the second place with only 33%, Kenneth with 20%, and Laura with 14%. And there was a smattering below that. But it looks like, for the most part, people think that the cast is on there legitimately. All right, so the next series of questions, I had a number of options. I had yes, no, sort of, or maybe, or I don't know. So I asked if y'all thought that Sarah was wrong to DM Jeremy directly after the getaway. So remember, Laura was reviewing that DM from Sarah to Jeremy, and when Laura was talking to Jessica. And 50% of y'all said yes, Sarah was wrong to DM Jeremy. And then 32% of you said sort of or maybe. So that's 82% of y'all thought it either was or could be a problem that Sarah DM Jeremy. And I guess I would agree to a point in that the first 90% of that DM I thought was actually really nice, appropriate, and something that I would hope a lot of people would do on the show. The first half was just like, hey, I know you're out of the pods now. I just wanted to say it was nice to meet you, and I don't hold any ill will against you. It was, I think, mostly that. It was mostly just breakup kind of stuff. But then that last thing at the end was, hey, if things don't work out with Laura, give me a call. Even that isn't like horrible the way that I think a lot of people thought it was. But given that presumably the women were friends with each other, Sarah should consider that she might be betraying her trust that might be kind of shaky and already with the Jesses and the Lauras and other. Sarah at the reunion was basically saying in the pods she felt like she was already being ganged up on, which I think is possible, because we can imagine that Jessica and Laura would have a strong social presence in the pods, in the lounge. At the very least, if Sarah, let's say, and maybe this is sort of the perfect scenario, is that Sarah sends that DM, and then when confronted about it at the lake, or maybe as soon as she walks into the lake party, she goes straight to Laura and says, hey, can we talk? And then says, hey, I just want to say I sent this DM. I don't know if you saw it. Laura says, yeah, I saw it. And then Sarah says, yeah, I just want to be clear. I'm not trying to undermine anything. And if you're upset, I get it. I'm lonely and I did love him and I feel like I screwed things up. And, or at least when AD confronted Sarah could have been like, yeah, thinking about it, I guess it was crossing the line. And I don't know. My only excuse, I'm not excusing it, is that I thought I had screwed up by not being more vulnerable in the pods. I wasn't trying to edge Laura out. I was more thinking, well, I don't know if things are going to work out. And if they don't, I don't know. I just wanted another chance. And yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said something like that. I'm guessing that AD and probably Laura would have been totally fine, but it blew up because Sarah just dug in and refused to acknowledge any rationality to what she was being told, which I think really backfired for her, not only with the women on the show, but also I think with the audience. The next question I asked is, Jeremy is purposefully manipulative. And 62% of y'all said yes, Jeremy is purposefully manipulative. And 17% of y'all said that it is possible that Jeremy is purposely manipulative. And yeah, it's hard to know what we all mean by that. If you're saying yes to that, it's hard to know what I meant by it when I included it as an item. But I was trying to get a lay of the land with y'all about this question because that is a possible conceptualization. Now, does that mean psychopathy or antisocial? It could, but there are many other possibilities as to why someone would be purposefully manipulative. So, yeah. And it certainly has that look to it, right? At times in the edit. Like when he's at the lake party and he's like, yeah, Laura's trying to make me out to be the bad guy. And you're thinking, how else would it be looked at? He seemed to think that she was the bad guy and that he was victimized by her. And I think that there's a possibility that he actually sees it that way. There's also a possibility that that is actually true, and we just weren't given that in the edit. So I guess my first hypothesis would be that it's not purposeful for him and that it's more distorted for him, but it could be purposeful. Anyway, the next question I asked is, was Chelsea valid regarding confronting Jimmy about going to the birthday party? Because when I was making this survey, I hadn't even posted the episodes of that scene, right? And so I didn't really know your opinion. I think I might have seen opinions online about it. It seemed like the opinion online, and I was kind of surprised by this, was that Chelsea is a jerkface and that she is clingy and very annoying. There were people that were making fun of her. Travis Kelce, actually, I saw a clip of him making fun of her on his podcast. Jimmy Fallon had Jimmy on the show, and Questlove and they were recreating the scene between Jimmy and Chelsea, and then Jimmy comes out and everyone's cheering. And I just thought, I didn't realize that would be the seeming majority opinion. I thought that, given the past, because this is a very similar situation to Cole and Zeneb or to Nick and Danielle, right? And I don't really remember the crowd reaction to Nick and Danielle, but I do remember the reaction to Cole and Zeneb, in that most people, at least in the beginning of the season, were very much on Zeneb's side. And I don't take any sides. I just think that both people are trying. And I thought that there would at least be a little bit more of a debate between Chelsea and Jimmy. Now, I will say that I think the underlying premise of the crowd reaction is possibly a good sign that people are recognizing unfair behavior, because in terms of the edit, it did seem unfair. Not that Chelsea woke up in the morning and says, I'm going to be unfair. It, I think, derives from a very, very common distortion and reactivity. So I think that that's positive, but the jump from that to ridicule of her or just calling her an idiot or piling on, that's so immorally wrong on so many levels. It is very upsetting to me that anybody would try to make Chelsea feel bad. It's deplorable, honestly. And really, I will say that to Jimmy Fallon. This is a human being who was vulnerable. Does anyone watching the show, I mean, maybe they do. Do you think Chelsea chose to have that reaction? Do you think she said, you know what, I want to have this reactivity. I want to be extremely upset and scared and sad and paranoid. Like that's a choice she makes, and it's deplorable, really. I'm more and more upset about it. It's mob bullying, and it's immoral. It's wrong. It's evil. It's just evil. You can have your thoughts, and if you're at home and you can say your stuff at the TV, but as soon as you start going online, this notion, I'm pretty sure in 50 years, they will look back on us today and say that we were just a hair away from the Roman Colosseum, in which we just threw slaves into the pit and told them that they had to kill each other or die. There's nothing wrong with watching the show. There's nothing wrong with yelling at your TV. There's nothing wrong with talking with your friends. There is, I think, something wrong with the collective harm that is waged against these people. And a lot of people will say, well, they knew what they were getting into. I don't think they knew. I don't think anyone knows. There's a lot of people who don't watch reality TV. There's also a lot of people who don't go online. Like, they'll watch a TV show, but they never go online to have conversations about it. That might seem kind of weird for us, but I think the majority of viewers of these shows don't do that. So, yeah. So I asked, Chelsea, was she valid in confronting Jimmy about going to the birthday party? And 65% said no, Chelsea was not valid to confront him. And I've heard people have sent me, because there's a fair amount of other podcasts that they've been involved in, and there seemed to be some possibility that Chelsea had at least some reason to be upset about him going out or something. But even considering the things that I heard, I don't see any validity to her confronting him about that. So I'm pretty strong about that. Could she bring up how she was feeling? Yes, she is valid in saying, so when you left last night, I don't know if this is me and my insecurities, but when Mackenzie called me and said that I just have some questions. Can you reassure me? Can you comfort me? Can you clarify for me? I'm just wondering. She could say that, but he went out for an hour. He was there probably for 15 minutes, and then he came home, and she was already cuddled up. It's an hour. I don't think she was valid at all. At the same time, I don't think she was choosing to have a reaction. Anyway, the next question I asked is about Chelsea being abusive. And 25% of y'all said yes, Chelsea is abusive. 29% said sort of maybe. So about 54% of y'all thought yes or maybe. And a third of you, 33%, said Chelsea is not abusive. And I have already gone over this in my reaction videos. When people filled out this survey, they had not seen the episodes that I go through all the borderline abuse. I'm not saying it's borderline abuse. I'm not saying she's borderline. I'm not even saying it's abusive. And I also don't know if Jimmy felt abused. But what I will say for sure, I keep thinking I'm saying sure weird. Is this a Washington, is this a Seattle thing? Sure? Sure, right? Anyway, I am positive that Chelsea was exhibiting in the edit several classic abusive behaviors. And the way it was coming across, like where it was deriving from was classic intimate partner violence. The reactivity, the accusations, the emotionality, the demands, the vibe. There were so many things. Now, I'm not saying she's a horrible person. I actually think the opposite. I think she is a good person who has been through some stuff early in her life. And as with most abusive people in my experience, they don't understand. No abusive or very few abusive people have any clue that they are being abusive. Even when you show them another abusive relationship, I've done this before, they will say, well, yeah, that's abusive, that's horrible, but that's not what I'm doing, because they live in a distorted, weird world that from the outside, you would say, what's wrong with you? But if you live inside their world, you understand. It doesn't make it right, but it all makes sense to them. And while we're on this topic, I want to point out, and I'm not a fan when people do this all the time, but if she were a guy and Jimmy was a woman, then I would imagine that people would have a much different opinion about it. Now, gender isn't swappable like that exactly, because Jimmy as a man will in all likelihood feel more power in his ability to defend against it. And Chelsea will feel less power in her action against Jimmy. So there's that. But if things were different, and I'll go over this in final thoughts, but just one detail here is let's say you have a husband or a boyfriend who is telling his girlfriend, his wife, that she cannot have friends, that she cannot leave the house. She was saying that. She was saying, I don't want to be with, she wasn't saying it like hard line, but she was basically saying, I don't want to be with someone in the midst of being very emotional, right? If it's one, I'll go over this in my final thoughts, but those are pretty classic behaviors. And yelling at him about a past relationship that he had, you fucked her, that's what abusive people will do. Just imagine a guy, imagine Jeremy doing this. We heard allegations around this. And that jealousy and that aggression and the finger pointing and the emotion and I don't think it's hard to picture people and yourself, all of us, reacting and looking at a guy that was doing that, even if it's just that one instance where Chelsea was doing that in that moment, even if alcohol is infused in that, I think a lot of people would go, whoa, 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 whoa. Women can be that way too. Women can be that way too. Women can be just as abusive. It's less often, it's less frequent, but when we look at the research, sometimes when we broaden the definition of power and control and consider that a lot of male victims will not even conceptualize themselves. In fact, I would say most male victims will never think of themselves as being abused because it's inconceivable that a man could be a victim and that a woman could be abusive. So we have to ask people about their experiences because we don't have drones that are invisible watching every relationship. In terms of the prevalence of abuse and how it parses out regarding gender, we have to ask people. And we have to ask clinicians, like, what sort of people show up at your office? Well, it's not a mystery that there could be a factor there that men are being underreported as victims. At the very least, we know that it happens even with that limitation to the research. And it's a problem. We don't want anyone to be abused. We don't want anyone to be abusive. It doesn't matter what gender they are. It just all needs to stop. Now, sexism and misogyny and oppression is a major factor in all of the abuse that is waged against other human beings, meaning that society will often encourage and teach and support and excuse male aggression because, well, that's men, or she should know her place. That's a thing too, and let's attack that. I've been a feminist basically my whole life, and women can be abusive. Now, maybe y'all agreed with that, and you just thought, well, she had signs, but Jimmy didn't seem like he was being oppressed, and I would agree, but I think it's important that when we see Chelsea's behavior, that we identify it, in terms of the edit, as classic abuse. It's just classic abusive. Okay, next question. Jimmy shouldn't be friends with someone he had sex with. I wanted to know. So most of y'all, 58%, disagreed with that statement. I think meaning that 58% of y'all thought that it was totally fine for Jimmy to be friends with someone he had sex with in the past. But, that means a good number of you thought, no, I don't think Jimmy should be friends with someone he had sex with. And that doesn't surprise me. My thoughts on the matter. But the vast majority of people, I think the first time that I ran into this was when I was watching 90 Day Fiancé, and it was it Julia? Yeah, it was Julia and Brandon, and they were at the reunion. And at that point, I had thought, in terms of the edit anyway, that Julia seemed like a pretty relatable person. And she's from Ukraine, I believe. And in the reunion, she was strongly asserting the fact, according to her, that men and women can never be friends, and that it's always wrong for a guy to be friends with a woman at any capacity. And I thought, it was a disconnect for me, because I thought Julia was pretty well-rounded and relatable, and yet she had this archaic notion about gender. And, well, archaic is judgmental. I'll just say something that I can't relate to, something that isn't from my experience, and is frankly sexist against everybody. And so ever since then, I've noticed, I think a lot of people still hold to this notion as a given. And I'm sure people who hold to that position have a lot of anecdotal experience. Like, it's a common experience where you'll, as a woman, will think a guy is a friend of yours, and then they get drunk, and then they hit on you. This could be a year or two into a close friendship that had no sexual or romantic overtones, and all of a sudden he has a couple drinks in him, and he's like trying to get with you. And it's very hurtful, because in that moment you're thinking, so wait, this whole time? Now, both can be true. They could very much value you as a friend and have a crush on you, but it, at the very least, is somewhat betraying. And I think a lot of people have been through situations like that, regardless of gender. I've been through that. That's how, women friends. Well, one I can think of off the top of my head. This is long. It's years and years ago. And that happens, and it can be very upsetting, because they might have actually bucked the trend to begin with by having that friend. And people would say, he's just into you. He doesn't want to be your friend. You're naive. And you're defending. You're like, no. We're friends. You don't understand. We're different. And then boom, he hits on you. Oh, well, I guess everyone's right about it. And I think that's an unfortunate conclusion that people will come to. Are there things to think about? Yeah. But of course, men and women can be friends. And I'm sure a lot of you understand that. And so I think that now maybe the element of a friend he had sex with, maybe that's what a lot of people are, because it's like 42% were not firmly saying that it was okay that he was friends with her. Or maybe the quality of the friendship. Chelsea was saying, she was implying that they were texting each other like, every 2 minutes throughout the day, or every 5 minutes throughout the day. That's what she was implying. But Jimmy never defended himself around that, which I guess could make him look like maybe that was happening. But I think he just didn't want to get into it, because he's, we're not supposed to be talking about her. We've been over that, but he went over that. And so We don't know how often they were texting. I'd be surprised if they were texting throughout the day. I would be surprised. He has a lot of friends, and she's one of them. So I just don't imagine that's true. And even if it were true, she's just a friend. Let's say that he was texting her throughout the day. He has a friend that he likes to talk to. What's wrong? As long as it's not interfering directly with his like if in the middle of having a conversation with Chelsea, he's like, ooh, give me a second. I have to text with my friend. Shut up. Yeah. But both people can have friends to whatever capacity. You want your partner to have friends, don't you? You want them to be fulfilled. You don't want them to rely completely on you. You don't want them to not leave the house to have. So I feel like it's just a complete non-issue that now maybe there's some details there, but we never heard anything other than what Chelsea was saying while she was very worked up and saying a lot of, you could call them lies or you could call them distortions. She said, someone told me Jess was there. I do not think that happened. She was holding to that position for a while and maybe even was headed to that position from the very beginning of that fight. I don't think anyone told her that Jess was there. It's ridiculous to think that even happened. I don't think that Mackenzie called her up and said, where are you? I saw Jimmy. He's out. And Jess is here. I don't think that anybody said that. She said that. Who knows of the things she said that night? Who knows how much of those were distortions? Anyway, I guess I just have a bone to pick with these notions, as you could probably tell. I'm not saying it's always fine, but, there's a lot of loneliness in the world. A lot of people are understandably complaining about not having friends and not having support, being isolated. And I just think if you can get a friend and they happen to be someone that you had sex with once in the past, then you want to hold on to that friend. Friends are hard to come by. The few really close friends that I have in my life, I've had to work at and hold on to and put effort into and sometimes defend. And you have to deal with their bullshit, and you have to deal with people's bullshit about you putting up with their bullshit. And I just think this notion of like these clean boundaries all the time, it has to look like the heteronormative 50s version in our head of like it's the nuclear family, and the guy has his buddies that he plays pool with, and the woman has her Tupperware parties, and the kids play with their toys and do their school, all that kind of shoving it into that model. I think this is a part of that. I do. I really do. And also, while I'm hot on the collar about this, often this notion that men and women can't be friends is based on the premise that was highly put forth, heavily put forth, strongly put forth in the movie When Harry Met Sally, when what's-his-face says, well, men and women can't be friends because men, all they're trying to do is try and get into your pants. And there's so many things problematic with that statement. One is that that's what jealous husbands and boyfriends will say to keep you isolated. That's one. Number two is it's incredibly offensive and sexist and unfair to say that about me. I'm a dude, and I'm a dude. Like, I hold to masculine ideals. Now, maybe some people think of me as a cuck or a simp or whatever. Well, I know they do, a mangina, because, anytime I say I'm a feminist, I get that kind of comment. And, okay, but the associations that people have with men regarding sex and drive, and I'll just say that, I'm a human being. I'm a red-blooded dude. Because I say all that because I think a lot of people would say, like, well, Kirk, he's this nice, soft, almost like non-sexual person. And that's not true. I'm guessing that people know that's not true. I say all that because, people say, well, Kirk, we're not saying about you because you're not a typical guy. I'm here to tell you I'm kind of a typical guy. There's a lot of typicalness to me in a lot of ways, not just in this way, but in a lot of ways. I watch football on Sunday. I drink beer. I high five my buddies. I play video games. I get aggressive when people call out my masculinity. I have been in fights. I'm not standing by the behavior. I'm not this like special human being. I'm a human being. And so for people to blanketly accuse men of that, I find to be very hurtful. And I think that will cause the problem. If you don't want men to be this way, like harassing people at work because they're constant, it's like, well, men, that's all they think about is sex. If you don't want them to be that way, part of the road to wellness is to stop saying that men are all like that and assuming that all men are like that. We are like everyone else on the planet. We have drives and we have attraction. We have an impulse or an urge or thoughts. And generally speaking, we know where to point it and we can modify it or suppress it or get rid of it. Okay, so the next question I asked is about Jimmy and Jess being a better match. I said, do you think Jimmy and Jess would have been a better match? And 56% said no, that Jimmy and Jess would not be a better match. And I think maybe like 20% said that they might be a better match. So yeah, it's hard to say. What's my opinion? I would say, yeah, given what I saw in the edit, I don't know if they would have been a good match, but I think they would have been a better match. I think that Jimmy would have, upon meeting Jess and seeing nonverbals, really both of them, because their breakup happened, I think a large factor was they couldn't see each other's nonverbals. And at the very least, I'd be interested to see how that would have worked out. In fact, I think I've said this before, I could see them actually really working out, because I think once Jimmy commits, I think it's hard for him to question that in the immediacy. Of course, he eventually did, but I could see him weathering lesser storms. And I think Jess, in terms of what we saw in the edit, I don't think she would have presented much of a storm for Jimmy. So, I could see them actually working out. But most of you didn't think they would have worked. In fact, by the nature of the question, I said Jimmy and Jess are a better match. Most of you think that Jimmy and Jess are a worse match than Jimmy and Chelsea, which I think is interesting. The next thing I asked is Chelsea and Trevor are a better match, and 52% said no. So that's interesting, because I would have thought more people would think that. But after the reunion, right? You think, well, and I guess given the reunion, you would think more people would say nobody would be a good match with Trevor, because I think the overwhelming response was that Trevor was lying, which is what I asked next. So Trevor is mostly lying. I asked y'all that, and 60% of you said yes to that, and 13% said sort of or maybe. So 73% of you were saying either strong yes or possibly that Trevor is mostly lying across the board. And that is the dominant narrative. And I said in the videos during the reunion that I can make no rational case that Trevor is not mostly lying. If I were on a jury, we went to deliberate, I would say, look, I think Trevor is actually telling the truth at the reunion. Now, you could argue that even if he was telling the truth at the reunion, he's lying somewhere. He's deceiving somewhere, even to himself. And I would say that to the jury, to my fellow jurors, but I would also say, but if you all vote that he's guilty, I have to concede, because all of the evidence is pointed in that direction, and all we have to go off of is his statement that he's toxic and messed up and it's more complicated than it seems. So I get it. And then I asked, do you think Trevor's mostly telling the truth? And 60% of you said no, Trevor is not mostly to. Okay, so this next question I asked is a variation on the previous questions because I was really curious. I wanted to ask a lot of questions about Trevor from different angles because I wanted to make sure that I had a pretty good understanding of where y'all landed with this. And I asked, do you think that Trevor is truthful, but he wasn't really ready for marriage? So it's a different way of asking the question. And 22% of you said yes, that you thought that Trevor is basically being truthful and he just wasn't ready for marriage. He screwed up. He didn't understand, or he was lying to himself or something. Also, 15% of you said sort of or maybe, and 40% of you said no. So I find that to be interesting because, if I'm asking you, do you think that Trevor is mostly lying? Then 60% says yes, and 13% says sort of maybe. So, there's a lot of people saying that, yeah, Trevor is mostly lying. But then when I ask the question from a different angle, Trevor is being truthful, and he just wasn't ready for marriage. Then we get a different percentage. 40% of you said no to that, whereas 37% of you say yes or maybe. There's a bunny in my yard looking really relaxed. Usually they look more terrified, but it's spring. So, well, actually, technically, it's not spring for me yet. It's still in the middle of the winter. Probably spring for you, though. Anyway, so another question I asked is, Clay is mostly lying. What do you think about that? And 63% said no, Clay is not mostly lying. And yeah, that surprising how by the end of the season, how many people seemingly online were pro Clay. Like when I was going over the most liked people, Clay is the 5th most liked cast member above Amber and Jess and Jimmy and Kenneth. Clay was well liked. And I think that's great. I don't think anyone should be disliked really, but I think that shows something. So Clay is mostly lying, and most of you said no, he's not mostly lying. I also asked, Clay was truthful and he shouldn't have wasted AD's time. And 53% yes, he is being truthful and he should not have wasted AD's time. And 24% said sort of maybe. Yeah. I don't know, it's hard to know exactly, but I would like to believe, that's a way to put it, that Clay was not knowingly wasting anybody's time. I think he thought there's a chance that he will come out on the other end of this process married. I think he was hoping for that. I bet you if you held him to it, he would say, well, it's not like, if you maybe just before the pods or even at the beginning of the pods, I would imagine that he would say, I don't think it's likely. So another question I asked was, AD should not have dated Matthew. What I was asking about was post-filming, but I was wondering if people interpreted that as she should never have dated him even in the pod. So I don't know exactly how people were landing there, but either way, 51% of y'all said yes, AD should not have dated Matthew, and 12% of you said sort of maybe AD should not have dated him. And 24% said no, it's fine that AD dated Matthew. And I'm going in that direction, and I'll get to that in my final thoughts. But originally, and I reacted this way during the reunion, that I just remember being astonished and I guess kind of even upset, distressed, when I heard that AD had gone on 2 dates with Matthew, had gone to his place. And after giving it some more thought, with some distance from the pods, because that's all we know of Matthew, right? And some reworking of the hypotheses that you really have to kind of insert. Because if you just look at the edit, regardless of any conceptualization regarding neurodivergence or anything, it was pretty atrocious. The edit could have been easily leaned into that narrative, right? But even with the editing, it's hard to defend anything that happened there. But when I kind of zoom out, and when I actually was rewatching the scenes that they showed during the reunion, I kind of started to, with some distance, have more room for other and more sympathetic points of view about him. So I'll get into that later. But then I asked, is Matthew purposefully manipulative? I asked that about Jeremy as well, and 60% of you said yes. And then I asked, Matthew is well-meaning but awkward, and 55% of you said no. So that, I think, reflects what a lot of people are thinking about him. Of the people that were the most disliked, according to the survey, Matthew was number 2 behind Jeremy. But I wonder if we might be able to come to at least the having another possible angle of looking at it, other than that Matthew was being purposely manipulative. There's a chance that that actually wasn't the case. In fact, the more I think about it, and I'll get into it in my final thoughts, the more I think that is not the case. Then I asked, Ken was never really attracted to Brittany, yes or no? And 52% of you said yes, Ken was never really attracted to Brittany. Then I asked, what about the other way? Brittany was never attracted to Ken. And 54% of you said no. So most of you think that Ken was never really attracted to Brittany. But there's a good number of you that are like, well, I don't know, or no, I think he was attracted to her at some point. And a slightly less amount of you think that Brittany was not attracted to Ken. So I think that the question about attraction between the two is hard to say for all of us, right? I think the narrative they were trying to put forth was that Ken was having issues. But my interpretation, and this is also incorporating interviews with Ken and Brittany after, that they were both having issues, I think. And I think each were having issues in their own ways. And it's hard to know if they had some catalyst, if that could have helped them. But I think it was just a chemistry thing. They had chemistry in the pods, they meet in real life, and it just wasn't there, which is a very common experience. If you've ever had Tinder dates, Hinge dates, this kind of thing, it's very common. Meeting people in person, it's less common because you won't necessarily respond to someone to go on a date with them, like if you meet at a party or at work or something, unless you feel that spark together. But it's very common without being physically with someone that once you're with them, it's just not there. Attraction is a very strange thing. And then I asked, how much did you like this season? Did you love it or hate it? And 17% of you said that you loved this season. 48% of you said it was above average. And I don't know, the way I designed this question, it's kind of bad. I should have said far above average. Love it. You could love it and also think that it was average because you always love it. But anyway, 17% of you said that this is problems with psychometrics. You got to really think about how to design a question. There are standards that I really wasn't even following. I don't even like the way I asked the questions before, yes, no, maybe. Anyway. So 17% of you said you loved it. 48% of you said it was above average. That's what, 65% of you think this is one of the better seasons. And I would agree with that. I mean, it's hard to remember how each season is, but I thought there were some notable improvements, and I think the cast provided a lot of richness. The Clay situation, the Chelsea situation. 25% of you said it was average. It was an average season of Love is Blind. So what is that? It's 80% of you or 90% of you think average or above average season. And then 9% of you thought it was below average, and 1% of you hated the season. It's a pretty low rate. I mean, if you can get a satisfaction, distribution curve of that for anything, particularly a reality TV show on Netflix, you have succeeded. Okay, so the last question I asked on the survey is, if y'all had any hot takes on the season, and I pulled some notable hot takes here. And a lot of these hot takes were shared by a number of people. Some of them weren't, but anyway. Anonymous said that Chelsea got off easy at the reunion. This was a common hot take, and I saw this said online as well. And I think my wife even said this. And yeah, I don't think anyone should be targeted. I think particularly Chelsea. I don't think we would have got much out of confronting Chelsea. It would have been interesting. It would have been interesting to see. But I don't think it would have been okay to do that. I think going after Jeremy, because it's all about what you think someone can handle. Some people were concerned about Trevor, and I would be too. Just because he is a dude and he's got muscles and a mullet, that doesn't mean that he in fact, when you think about people who complete suicide, you should be thinking about men. A lot of people don't. The vast majority of completed suicides are men. And that's something that we need to understand. There are a lot of speculated factors around that. Men are more violent when they use methods. They also are much less likely, given their socialization and their lifestyle, to have anyone to talk to or to reach out. So there's that. But, Trevor, you kind of worry about. Anyway, my point is that I'm glad they didn't go after Chelsea. I don't think we would have gotten anything really new. I also don't think it would have been safe to go after her. And she's already gotten enough as it is online. I think let's just not. Going after Trevor was interesting because it was a lot of new data. Going after Jeremy for the issues that they went after him, there's some new data there. Michelle said AD's dating of Matthew after the show ended proves that she ignores red flags. Yeah, a lot of people had a hot take along those lines. And yeah, it's shocking to me too. Having said that, I think there's a story here that Matthew is not as bad as the narrative is trying to say, and not as bad as I initially thought. But having said that, I think regardless of that, people would say, well, AD has some issues. And I'll get into that when I get into my final thoughts about AD. And it's basically just a summary of what I've already said. There's something kind of new there. Anyway, anonymous annual patron from Los Angeles says, I think, but definitely not sure, that Clay might have relationship OCD. He was very preoccupied with trying to find certainty and also with the idea that he was going to cheat, even though he said he didn't want to. This is a great comment. Relationship OCD is something that gets thrown around a lot on the internet. I would say that 99% of the time, relationship OCD is being used as a term that really people should just be using preoccupation instead. Relationship OCD is it's OCD. It's a type of OCD, and OCD is very particular. And just being really preoccupied or worried about relationships, that is a far cry from having obsessive compulsive disorder, which is very particular, and people suffer a lot. Now, you can suffer a lot from preoccupation as well, but anyway. But anonymous annual patron from Los Angeles, this might be one of the times when we might have something to say. I'll get into that in a second, but let's talk about relationship OCD. So again, relationship OCD is OCD. It's just the way in which the OCD is being directed. In the same way that you can have OCD regarding germs or cleanliness, or some people will have obsessions around religious things, like if they don't pray perfectly 10 times a day, then very, very bad things will happen to them or other people. They might have, people with OCD might have obsessions about counting things. Hopefully everyone knows of those kind of classic presentations. Well, with relationship OCD, it's all of the symptoms and hallmarks of OCD. It's just about relationships. So, for example, if we took someone with cleanliness OCD, these individuals are constantly obsessing about cleanliness. They're in a constant state of fear of being unclean, and they basically can never relax. OCD is rough. It is a rough condition. It might come and go, but when people are symptomatic, it's horrible. And they might be able to function at work and in life, but underneath the surface, they're just gripping the wheel, white knuckling it as they go through life. So with a cleanliness OCD individual, they might be washing their hands like hundreds of times a day. They might be bleaching their hands 20 times a day. Their hands might just be covered in wounds that are a result of overwashing and bleach and that kind of thing. It maybe even scrubbing, and it gets rough. And they usually know that their obsession and their fear is irrational. They often will have that knowledge and that insight, at least to some extent, but they have no control over the intrusive thoughts and just the constant barrage of you're unclean, you better wash, you're unclean, you better wash. If you don't, this bad thing will happen, and there's a lot of suffering. Okay. So with relationship OCD, everything's the same, but instead of cleanliness, just put in relationships. But it's very different from preoccupation. Let me explain. So yeah, these individuals might look like preoccupied attachment, anxious attachment, in that they're very obsessed with relationships. And they might be very obsessed with abandonment, similar to preoccupied individuals, or obsessed about infidelity, or obsessed about texting me back, that kind of thing. But they often also obsess, or only obsess, about other aspects of relationships that have nothing to do with preoccupied attachment and have everything to do with just relationships. So they might obsess about whether or not they truly love their partner. And they have constant intrusive thoughts of, how do you know, like some people have OCD around abusing children sexually. They have no urge to do it. They are not attracted to children. But when they leave the house and there might be children around, they have these intrusive thoughts that are completely irrational, have nothing to do with their urges. These thoughts of, well, what if you do get attracted to a child and you try to fondle that child, or you harm the child, or you do something else to a child? What if that happens? What if that happens? What if that happens? What if that happens? You better do something about it. You better do something about it. You better do something about it. Similar to, some people can have OCD manifest in a variety of ways, but one of the ways it would manifest for that individual is they're worried that they're going to jump off a bridge. What if you're walking on a bridge and you decide to jump off? Or what if you're driving your car and you just decide to drive into traffic? What if, even though there's no urge to do that? And they know that it's irrational, but the intrusiveness of the thoughts, just like, what if it happens? What if it happens? Okay. So with relationship OCD, it's just like that. What if you don't like this person? What if you're not attracted to them? What if your relationship will end and it's all your fault? However the intrusive thoughts manifest, it has to do with relationships, and so we call it relationship OCD. It might be, what if they cheat on you? But often it has to do with their own behavior. Often it has to do with, what if I cheat on my partner? Or what if I don't love my partner? What if I'm just tricking myself that I love my partner, even though when they think about it, like, well, of course I love my partner. But what if you don't know what love is? What if you don't know what love is? And it plagues them. It plagues them. That is very different from preoccupied attachment, right? It's like not even in the same ballpark as preoccupied attachment. So for people online, though, they'll hear the tagline of relationship OCD and they'll think, oh, I'm like that because I'm really obsessive about my partner and I'm constantly worrying. I have these intrusive thoughts about them cheating on me or leaving me and abandoning me. And then they'll label themselves as relationship OCD, and then they'll go online and find other people that also found their way to that label, and they all will confer and agree and support each other when, at least in my world, we call them preoccupied attachment or anxious attachment. And I think it's important to distinguish, because for people with OCD, I think that people need to understand how specific and how horrific it is. Like, I guess for myself, I would rather be anxiously attached than have any form of OCD. Because at least with preoccupied attachment, there are moments in time when you're probably not suffering. I mean, not always, but I don't know. And also there almost is an easier road to recovery, or at least temporary soothing with preoccupied attachment. And you can have severe preoccupied attachment. But anyway, I just want to make that clear. Now, for Anonymous Annual Patron, yeah, what you're identifying would be the justification to investigate that. I still don't think that's likely, given the way that Clay presents, because I didn't hear any hallmarks of suffering from obsessions and compulsions, for that matter. What we saw with Clay is that he was thinking a lot. We're not going to say obsessed, but we're going to say he was ruminating a lot on, what if I cheat on her? What if I cheat on her? What if I cheat on her? And also, what if I'm not really in love? What if I'm not really in love? What if I get married and I'm not really in love? What if that happens? And if we imagine a baseline with Clay where he actually very much did love her and did want to marry her, and yet these intrusive, obsessive thoughts were just attacking him and giving him all of this uncertainty, and he was just like, I need to know. And it was also in the presence of a lot of other, because typically with OCD, it doesn't often just only manifest within one narrow category of obsessions. Usually there are other obsessions that will at least be ancillary, if not fully within OCD. And often for people with OCD, they will move from one obsession to another over time, or incorporate new ones in without treatment. Anyway, so I think most people would conclude, including myself, based on the edit, that Clay was not unreasonably thinking a lot and ruminating a lot about whether or not he was actually wanting to marry her, whether or not he was actually invested, whether or not he might cheat. I think he had a lot of rational reasons to think that over. In fact, I think most people would think he would be irrational not to ruminate on that, particularly given the timeline and the stakes that were at play. So that's not OCD. If it's reasonable to ruminate, like if you had, at the beginning of the pandemic, given the very limited research that had been conducted about this brand new virus, and given how deadly it was at that point, a lot of people were ruminating and obsessing in the colloquial term, not in the clinical term, but thinking a lot about cleanliness and masking and germs. You wouldn't call those people suffering from OCD, even though it, for some people, was on their, especially during a certain span of time, it was on their mind 24/7, constantly thinking about it, right? Especially if they had to work outside of the home. That's reasonable, given the scenario, given what we were being told, given what the research at that point was telling us. Even knowing what we know now, I think it was rational to at least be extremely cautious and very, very worried. So you can have someone who's very, very thinking a lot about a particular thing like viruses and infection, but clinicians would not call that irrational, and the person involved in it also wouldn't call themselves as being irrational. For Clay, I don't think we would say that he was being irrational. Worrying that you're going to jump off a bridge, or worrying that you're going to sexually assault a child when you've never done it before and you don't have any urge to do it, is so far afield from rationality. Counting every brick in the room, and you have to do it 10 times in a very particular way, or else no one would say that that's rational. OCD is not rational. So if you are legitimately suffering from relationship OCD, there is nothing rational, or at the very least, extremely irrational. There might be some rationality to it. So, yeah. Now, when people suffer from OCD, particularly when they're at the pinnacle of their symptoms, particularly pre-treatment and medication, they can often exhibit no insight or acknowledgement of the irrationality of it. So insight into it isn't always present. I just want to be clear about that. All right, so this next hot take is from Anonymous. They say, the women always seem to be more toxic on these shows than the men. And this is coming from a woman. Yeah, I don't know what you mean by toxic, but I don't know. I think it doesn't really, in my mind anyway, fall along gender lines. I think there's a lot of issues from a lot of people, regardless of gender. But I think what Anonymous is getting at is that the common discourse and maybe the edit is often steering away from even the possibility that some of the women have what people might call toxic behaviors. And yeah, it's possible. I think there's a natural sympathy for women given sexism and particularly given the traditional harm that society and men have waged on women, that when you're watching reality TV, there can be an accommodation, and it's like, well, let's take it easy, because in the past we would, without any hesitation, would blame women for everything, even being a victim themselves, right? And when we put that under the microscope and we have a serious problem with that which is good, I think there can be like a hesitation to go there sometimes. Whereas for men, we don't really have that hesitation because men aren't traditionally protected in that way. Men are traditionally protected in that way. And so we're like, well, men don't need us to give them any favors. So I think that could be a factor. I think also the edit seems to kind of go that direction. Also, I don't know if this is true, but I think given the way that everyone is socialized regarding gender, that a lot of men, whether they're on the show or not, if they're going to exhibit a problem, their problems will be more noticeable. I don't know if this is true. I don't really like it as I say it, but the kinds of problem, because men are more socialized to be independent and strong and a player and above emotion, and they don't care about other people's feelings or whatever, that kind of socialization. Aggressive and not cooperative and not emotional. So when problems arise with that set of socialized behaviors and traits, then the kinds of problems someone's going to exhibit are going to be more noticeable and more problematic, right? So maybe that's it. Anyway, what do you think? I'm not really a super fan of what I just said, but I'm just improving on the fly. Yukon Katie says, all seasons are pretty sexist against women, but this one was the worst. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the AD stuff was very noticeable. We've already been over that. It's both, it's at the intersection of racism and sexism. But is this season more sexist? Yeah, everyone can have their own take on this, but I'm going to look at my notes of different seasons to kind of jog my memory. Season 1, sexist against women. You could say Jessica was at least treated by the audience. You could argue in a sexist way, I suppose. We had, Diamond and Carlton. You had Amber and Barnett, Lauren and Cam. Not really a lot of sexism in that season that I can point to. Season 2, you had Ayana and Jarrett, Danielle and Nick, Natalie and Shake. You had Deepti and Shake. You could argue a lot of sexism going on there. Yeah, right. So this season, I think a lot of people would point to Clay. A lot of people would point to the way AD was treated. I think some people might point to the way Chelsea was treated by the public as being fueled partially by sexism. That's a fair thing to say, in terms of the bullying. Because when women make mistakes in public, they are often bullied to a much greater degree than any guy would be bullied. It's sort of like, I don't know if this is even true to the way I think, but with Love is Blind and maybe other reality TV shows, it's harder for men to be liked, but it's also harder for men to get the full-on pile-on bullying the way women do. I've thought that before. I've thought, wow, I mean, I guess I understand why people don't like this person, but it just seems particularly energetic around that person. Anyway, so season 2 with Deep D and Shake is pretty bad. Season 3, Alexa and Brennan, Colleen and Matt, Zenab and Cole, Raven and SK, and nothing's coming to mind. I'm sure there's sexism somewhere in there. Season 4, Tiffany and Brett, Zach and Bliss, Chelsea and Kwame, Jackie and Marshall, Zach and Arena. Yeah, nothing's really jumping. Micah and Paul. Season 5, Lydia and Milton, Stacy and Izzy, Taylor and JP. You could argue that JP had some issues. It's hard to know exactly. Aaliyah and Uche. Yeah, I guess so. There were more themes of racism, sexism, religion, and more traditional gender norms, the following and the leading and all that kind of stuff. And Jessica being too assertive. All the seasons are pretty sexist against women, but this one was the worst. Yeah, I suppose on a short review, I'd agree with that. Kaylee says simply, love is not blind. Yeah. And, people will say that as, well, clearly love isn't blind. Well, it clearly is some of the time blind in terms of what I think we're getting at, in that Amy and Johnny fell in love. Now, maybe everyone would say, well, that's because when they met, they actually liked what they saw. So there's that. But, I think the premise is there. It's clearly not always blind. And one could even argue that the relationships that don't last weren't really in love. Although, I don't know, I think Jimmy and Chelsea were legit in love. You could say that Laura and Jeremy weren't fully invested. Brittany and Kenneth also. AD and Clay, you could say Clay wasn't fully invested. But, surely Jimmy and Chelsea, I think they were fully invested. And according to the survey, y'all kind of were in that direction too. A lot of the people who managed to get married on the various seasons, you could say that love is blind. Chelsea and Kwame. And a lot of people will say, this is not the sort of person I would usually go after, but we met in the pods and we bonded, so there you go. I mean, it helps that the vast majority of the cast is extremely attractive. I think compared to just like the upper echelon of people that we tend to see on the internet and on TV, these people can look pretty normal. But if you just put these people up against a lineup of just like average humans, these people, they've got to be at, top percentages, top 3%, 5% or something. So I guess the true test would be you have an Amy and a Johnny, and one of them is, in terms of standards of beauty, is just like obviously not within the, or anywhere close to the standard. I guess then you would, and that would be interesting, right? But I think the sad reality is that, yeah, love is not actually blind. You can be absolutely in love with someone, and if there's like zero attraction, I think maybe Brittany and Kenneth. Anyway, Jules says they should screen people better for this show. Yeah, a lot of people had that hot take, and I agree. I don't know if I agree with what people are hoping to achieve all the time, because I think it's fine if people go on the show because they want to further their career, as long as they also are ready for marriage and are there legitimately. And I think that accusation has been waged against a lot of the cast, the Trevors, maybe the Matthews, the Clays, this kind of thing, the Lauras, the Jeremys. But I think there's a strong case that could be made that a lot of the people were there, at least to some extent, legitimately. I mean, in terms of if I were to put money down on anyone not having gone on the show legitimately of the 15 people that were focused on, then by the way, Mackenzie is the 16th person on my list because we saw her showing up at some of the events, like the lake party, that kind of thing. And I asked my contact on the show, why was Mackenzie included? And I said, in previous seasons, like with Renee and Carter, they were included because they were expected to actually be on the show because they did get engaged in the pods, that kind of thing. And what my contact said was that, well, let me get it specifically. What she said was all ensemble party invites are brought in with purpose. So I think this might be production language, ensemble party, like the lake party, an ensemble party. So all ensemble party invites are brought in with purpose. And then she says, Mackenzie, was likely involved in a love triangle that was never shown. So she didn't know, but she's speculating based on the fact that Mackenzie was at that party and was also involved in other things. You would see her around. In all likelihood, she was in some sort of love triangle. Oh, meaning that Mackenzie was after one of the guys and was dropped, rejected, therefore invited in the same way that Jessica was invited and other people. And so, in all likelihood, she was in a love triangle. Mackenzie actually got engaged on the show, but was chosen not to follow their story, and they broke up not long after the pods. Oh, well, why did my contact say that second sentence then? What she's telling me is that she does know. It's so funny because there's so many details because we hear these accounts from production. And anyway, because, according to production, almost every season, or maybe every season, there's at least one couple that will get engaged, and production will review the footage or be monitoring the footage in the pods and say, I don't think those two are legitimately getting engaged. And although they might be fun to follow, we want to actually have couples that are legitimately trying to get married. And I could see this being a strategy because if you're trying to create a show that feels believable, it would serve production to weed out the couples that are not legitimately in love because it might come out. Plus, if it's later revealed after the show comes out that there's a lot of evidence that they aren't legitimately in love or engaged, then it'll undermine the entire model, the entire reason why people would watch the show. And that's why at the reunion they came out strong. And it was clear to me that they had a meeting and said, okay, hosts, you have to have these statements. You have to go down these roads with people, and we're bringing Matthew on, or we're bringing Trevor on. By the way, this whole time I might be occasionally mixing up Trevor and Matthew. I'm pretty good with names on this season, but there's something about Trevor and Matthew. I keep, maybe those names are just, anyway. So what my contact is saying is that she does know that they got engaged and they were not included. Now, what my contact isn't saying is that production determined that they were not a legit couple, because she either doesn't know that or she doesn't want to tell me that. But she is telling me that production decided not to follow their story. And then my contact says, and they broke up not long after the pods, which is, at least for production, and it stands to reason that their suspicion to them must have been right. Because if they were legitimately engaged, then at the very least, they should stay in a relationship for a few months, longer. But apparently they break up soon after. So she's saying that, and then what she's also saying is, well, Mackenzie must have been also in a love triangle, because otherwise why would she be invited to the ensemble party? Anyway. But where was I? They should screen people before being on the show. Yeah. Well, like I said, I guess they do screen at some point, and they're probably trying to screen, but I think they could do a better job screening. I'm going to take a guess and say that when they have their overall budget, that they don't want to allocate money to the casting side because it would take away money from other things that they value more. And I guess when you have a winning formula based on a certain budget, then it'd be hard to toy with that. And they're like, well, yeah, we'll recruit and it'll give us what we get, which is 1 to 3 couples being legitimately married at the end, and that's good enough for us. Let's avoid season 5, like with your Uches and your Lydias. Let's try to avoid that kind of thing from happening. But if we tighten that up, then we'll have what we have. And yeah, we're going to get some hop-ons if you watch Arrested Development. But overall, it's a good allocation of funds. Whereas for us, and I would be in this camp too, I would want more money, maybe double the money involved in casting. Because if you're going to screen better and you're going to be more picky and you're going to spend more time investigating these individuals' backgrounds, that's all money. You have to pay people to do that. And if it doesn't pan out in terms of, if it's not needed to create a successful show, then they're probably like, well, yeah, we'd love to do that, but we just don't have them. We'd much rather spend it on this side of things, paying for the production team to film more scenes. Another hot take from Anonymous says, I feel like Chelsea has a lot of narcissistic tendencies. She knows how to turn Jimmy into the bad guy and manipulate the situation to where she doesn't assume any responsibility for their arguments. Yeah, well, so in a nutshell, without going down a huge rabbit hole, that's not necessarily narcissistic. That's what people will say on the internet. They'll say it's narcissistic to, and it's so interesting because narcissism is, at least I would hope that people, the first thing you think of when you think of narcissistic, you should think someone who needs to believe that they're superior, that they're better, smarter, better looking, more successful, more able, that they have more awards, they have a lot, everyone loves them, and they're better at everything. That's not the only hallmark of narcissism, but I would hope that people would associate that. But it's been completely shifted to, when people think of a narcissist, they think of someone who is harmful. They think of someone who's abusive. Narcissistic personalitied individuals can be manipulative and abusive, but often not. They can be hard to deal with, but they aren't always abusive. Abusive people are always abusive, and abusive people can have a variety of personality problems, including narcissism. But anyway, so what Anonymous is saying is that Chelsea knows how to turn Jimmy into the bad guy and manipulate the situation to where she doesn't assume any responsibility for her arguments. I would say that she's terrible at making Jimmy out to be the bad guy, because my own reaction and the reaction of the crowd and the reaction of some of the cast members who would talk at the reunion and in interviews will say, wow. And they're not saying this like overtly, but what I think I'm hearing is that they're saying, I thought Jimmy was the bad guy, or I thought that everything was fine. Watching the show, Chelsea has issues. So I don't think she knows how to manipulate. Now, I guess you could say that Chelsea was good at convincing the other women anyway that Jimmy was the bad guy, and that's true. But I don't think it's volitional. It could be. And the fact that we might be able to say, well, not the fact, but some people would say she doesn't assume responsibility. Yeah, you could make a pretty good argument for that given the edit. But again, that's not necessarily a narcissistic thing, and it isn't only narcissistic people. Anyway, Bev says they need to recruit people who want to get married. Yeah, it's in terms of that screening thing. And again, I think they did recruit people who did want to get married. Now, there are probably some people who didn't want to get married, and I think there's a lot of people who were mostly or somewhat ready to get married. I think that Trevor and Clay were somewhere in the middle there. So people often have this black and white perspective, and maybe everyone's right. None of us can know. Nobody can know, including the casting. No matter how much background you do, if someone just says, "Yeah, I'm ready for marriage," there's no scientific way to demonstrate that they're lying about it. So this notion that there are questions about people's readiness means that they're completely just there to get famous. A lot of people had that point of view. Not a majority of you, but a lot of people did. And again, it's true, but I just don't think that's likely. I think that's a frequent online just thing that people will say. It's like the kind of things people will say about their political opponents, the other side of the aisle. It's like, well, they just don't care about humans. They're all just idiots. And it's not my experience. And this notion is like, everyone is there just to get clout. It's like, well, as I was saying in a previous video, Cameron and Lauren, you could argue there's a good case that they either knew or hoped or very least capitalized on the show to create an online. Well, actually, I don't know about Cameron and Lauren, but I do know about Deepti and Natalie from season 2. I watched this Forbes YouTube video, and in the video, they're being interviewed because they've made so much money from being influencers. Both of them had pretty good jobs, particularly Natalie. It's funny, they gave actual numbers of salaries. Natalie talked about how she, going into the pods, was earning like $250,000 a year. She was a consultant of some sort. So she was pretty successful. Going into the pods and coming out, Deepti and Natalie both worked hard to further their influencing career. Soon after the show was aired, they had a lot of sponsorships that they would, engage in. And both of them, I think, have said that they've earned millions post-show. Natalie said that she's earning 3 times her original salary, $750,000. And do we think that Natalie only went on the show because she wanted? Now, I'm sure there are people who think that, but I don't think that. I think that she went on legitimately and maybe even thought, in addition to that, this could be good for my career either way. Maybe I'll get married, maybe I won't, but I'll definitely be given an opportunity to see if I can supplement my career as an influencer. I'm guessing that Natalie didn't think it would grow as much as it did, but who knows? Anyway, so I think both can be true, and there's nothing wrong with that. There can be something wrong with it, but it isn't automatically a problem. So Veronica says, maybe not a hot take, but the scene where Clay's mother and father were talking, that was the best scene of the entire season. Yeah, a lot of people had that sentiment, and I didn't think about that in that way at the time, but hearing other people talk about it, I could get behind that. I was talking with Rebecca, and she said that. Allie says, Jeremy seems to be one of the most scariest evil people I've seen on the show. Jeremy has no remorse, no accountability. He's deceitful and manipulative. There's something off about him. Yeah, so normally I would push back on this and say, well, maybe that's true, but we can't really know. But yeah, especially after watching those TikToks of the allegations against him and his response, and then that aggressive tone that he had, hearing about the threatening someone with a gun, like there's some serious allegations. And of the times where we might see someone as legitimately being a candidate for that hypothesis, we don't usually see clear signs, and I think there are reasons to go down that road in this situation. Lashana says, people gave Chelsea and Jimmy way too much hate. Yeah. I would agree that any hate anybody gets is not okay. I mean, even Jeremy, because we just can't know. There's just no way to know anything. So anonymous YouTube member says, Ken was nervous about being affectionate towards Brittany because interracial relationships can receive a lot of hate. I appreciated this hot take because I hadn't seen it before personally, that Ken might have been standoffish with Brittany because he has seen and experienced himself the very real problem in our society that when you have an interracial relationship, you're going to get a lot of hate from the outside. And maybe particularly, and this isn't what anonymous YouTube member was saying, but particularly if you're a black man, that you will be accused of a variety of things from various different groups that will make you very nervous, maybe nervous about showing it on camera, right? And that could have been a factor when they were having that conversation on the boat, where she's like, you can touch me if you want. And he's just like, really? I thought, who knows? We can't know. CJ Lopez hot take is Clay is healthier than AD because AD does not appear to be confronting her relationship traumas in a productive way. I thought this hot take was interesting too. And I think there were a lot of hot takes that were kind of in this category of, AD seems like a good person, a likable person. And I think that AD's issues are kind of sneaky, but very robust. And if we go with that, then we could say, well, even though the narrative is that Clay is the broken one and AD is the healthy, mature one, looked at it a different way, Clay was facing the issue head on and was very willing to talk about it and out himself. Like all those conversations where he was talking about how he's worried he's going to cheat. It's very strange that he would even bring that up if he was a jerk face, right? Because cheaters don't bring it up. They don't usually announce beforehand. Sometimes they do, but the vast majority of the time, they hide it or suppress it or something. So he was bringing it up a lot on camera too. It's like, why? You don't have to. You could have talked about it off camera. He would out of the blue volunteer this stuff at times when it wasn't even a part of the conversation. AD wasn't talking with him about that. He just, so that is definitely a sign of health. Now, in terms of who's healthier, I don't know. They both have a lot of strengths individually, and they both have their issues that they're working on. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Anonymous patron and YouTube member says, Chelsea would be a really good partner if she felt security. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is kind of a hot take, and that I imagine it's not very common. And yeah, I think I've said similar things already about Chelsea, but absolutely, I think Chelsea would be a very good partner if, and maybe once she goes through therapy, once she feels secure and feels that she's worthy of love. I think she'd be an amazing partner for sure. Shay LJ, their hot take was, this was the best reunion concept. And I gave it some thought, and I agree with that. I was worried about the crowd being a Jerry Springer crowd, but they weren't. There were still some problems, like, ooh, and I pointed those out, but it was way better than it was before, which makes me believe that the producers approached the audience differently. If you've ever been a part of a live studio audience, you know how it goes. There's prep before they start rolling. There's someone that comes out and says, hey, these are the rules, or hey, get energetic, or hey, I really want to hear your reaction, so give me a ooh, or give me a yay, or give me a boo, or and they will give that to the crowd. And when they put it out there and you're in this crowd, you just kind of go along with the crowd. So since we did not hear that from the crowd, there must have been a different approach to the crowd, which I will 2 thumbs up. But honestly, I still wish there just wasn't a crowd at all. We don't need a crowd. And it seems like it would stress out the cast even more, which would make it harder for them to be honest, Anyway, but yeah, I thought that the crowd was overall fine and was way better than I thought it was going to be. The questions were really good, I thought, and they were executed really well. They were followed up with, both the hosts really would keep at it. They were tracking it pretty well. They allowed deep moments to breathe, and like that moment between Clay and Brett was a very organic moment that could only have happened if they didn't intervene or try to interrupt. And I'll commend the rest of the cast for that too. There wasn't a lot. There were occasional moments, but there wasn't a lot of interrupting of each other. Like no. Like Clay was allowed to really go down a road. Also, Trevor was allowed to really go down. There would have been an impulse in previous seasons to interrupt him, and that could also be production as well. Production might have told the cast either nothing, or they might have even told, because in previous seasons they might have encouraged the cast to interrupt. I don't think that's true, but it could be. Who knows? But I will commend the cast for not jumping down Trevor's throat in the middle of his talk. Now, maybe some people would say there were a lot of hot takes saying that Trevor was treated harshly, and I don't know. I think that Trevor, given the circumstances and the facts on the ground, I think it was rational or fair to expose that and to give him a chance to respond. And I think he was. I just think that the audience and the public, there's just almost no chance that if he was being truthful, which I don't know, there's apparently, and I imagine this to be true at the time, very little chance that that story would be believed, because it's just not a story that you usually hear, or that even if you're going through it yourself, if you're in Trevor's shoes, it's not a story that even you would identify for yourself in that way. Anyway, also there seemed to be a good balance between tension and light moments, kind of meaning that there weren't a lot of light moments, because the light moments are fine, but they're not very interesting. Not that I want people to suffer, but I don't really care about saying, this couple is doing great, and look how great they're doing. Again, yes, I'm not going to say don't do that, and I don't want to paint this picture that therapists, because it's a stereotype that we're only interested in dysfunction. We're not. We love success and love. It's just, and there's a lot of things you can do as a therapist to build that up and encourage it and point it out and strengthen it. But in terms of the things I was curious about, I was curious about a lot of things that would require some tension. Anyway, there seemed to be pretty good balance. And the hosts didn't have any gaffes, as far as I know. I mean, I'm sure some people would identify, because everyone always hates the hosts. I don't really understand that. I think you can certainly have your criticism, but I don't understand. It's like there's almost nothing they can do right. It has the smell of, well, we all agree, right, that we can bully these people, because it's sort of like punching up. And I just feel like that's, I don't know, it's just uncool. But maybe I'm out of touch and I have no idea. The same thing happens in NFL football. Everyone hates Joe Buck and Troy Aikman, and people tend to like Tony Romo, but even him, he'll get attacked. These are the announcers of the games. You're watching the game and you hear two guys talking, and people almost always hate these guys, and I'm always like, I think they're fine. I either don't really care, or I'm like, oh, that was a good point, or that's entertaining, or thanks for saying that bit. I didn't know that part. And so I just think it's a social phenomenon. It's like you just want to hate someone. It's sort of like hating refs, actually, in all the sports. And yeah, refs make mistakes for sure. There can be corrupt refs. There can be biased refs. But generally speaking, they're doing their best, and sometimes they make a mistake. And of course, when they make a mistake that impacts your team, confirmation bias and selection, you're like, I hate that ref. They're always against us. But when you zoom out, and this is coming from a Seahawks fan, where we've had some pretty famous problematic ref moments, like in the Super Bowl with Pittsburgh. I've reviewed all those tapes. I've looked at the camera and I've broken it all down, and a good half or more of the moments where a lot of Seattle fans will say the refs definitely had it wrong, I'll say, well, maybe, but given what they had to review in person and on camera when they're reviewing the tape, I kind of agree with the call. when we lost to Pittsburgh, I was bummed. That was our first Super Bowl. It was upsetting to me. But anyway, so I thought that the hosts of Love is Blind Reunion Season 6, just in terms of my memory, there weren't any gaffes, like previous season when Vanessa, is that her name? Anyway, the woman, she was asking one of the cast members, when's a baby coming? And, I don't think it's a high crime, but I understand the criticism. I had it at the time myself of just like, well, you don't know if they're going to have kids, and there might be some tension around that for individuals. You don't have to ask that question. I mean, you can certainly ask in a different way, like, what are your plans in the future or whatever. You don't have to do that thing that a lot of people suffer from, people in your family, like, when's the baby coming? When's the baby? Because it's like, knock it off. And she was doing that. Again, I don't think it's a high crime, but there didn't seem to be any gaffes like that. So yeah, I agree that it was a good reunion concept. Having people like Brett there, I think was good. Having some of the other people there seemed irrelevant, but I don't really mind it the way I think some people did. Having the past cast members ask questions I thought was interesting because those questions were more crowd-oriented, I don't know if I was a fan of the meme mentioning. The host would say, hey, AD, I'm going to ask you a question. What number do you want? That kind of thing. I mean, I don't know. I guess I was kind of neutral about that. Because some of the jokes, I thought, well, we shouldn't be joking about that. That's not a funny thing. Anyway, but yeah, overall, I thought that the reunion, this could just be me and my optimism, but it seems to me like the production, which would make sense, that they are learning from mistakes and they're refining the model as they go and are figuring out ways to, at the very least, avoid criticism, but at best actually make things better for everybody. The cast, the crew, us, the hosts, reunion, they're figuring out ways to make it more successful and they're thinking about sustainability, So anyway, patron Clada says, I understand that Trevor messed up a lot, but the shame everyone showed him was truly destructive. Yeah, a lot of people had that point of view. And it's interesting because at first glance, I would think, oh, maybe they're actually seeing the hypothesis that I am wondering about. I don't know. Maybe Trevor is a jerkface, but I did have an hypothesis that was pretty sympathetic to him. So I'd read a lot of these hot takes, and I'd think, oh, maybe there's other people in that category. But then when I look at it, it was not the case. This one actually could be in that, but a lot of people were like, okay, fine, Trevor was a manipulative, lying asshole, but I think they went overboard with the shaming. But I wonder, because if he did what he's being accused of, which is possible, I think shaming someone for that is justified. And I've already mentioned this in previous videos, but to go onto a show and to play with someone else's heart and life, because you're not only playing with their heart, but you're making it so, if Chelsea had chosen Trevor and if Trevor was lying all the time to her and to production, then not only would that just be so pathological and psychopathic to do to somebody, to just play with someone's heart like that, but also you'd be denying Chelsea the opportunity to see if things would work out with someone else like Jimmy. And that is highly problematic. And if true, then I think he deserves to be treated the way he was at the reunion. And I don't even think he was treated that poorly. If that's true, then I think him being called out for it, I think is absolutely justified. The only thing that would make it a pile-on is if Trevor, have I been saying Matthew? I hope by context everyone understands what I'm saying. The only way that it would be unfair as a pile-on is if Trevor was kind of at least telling the truth. Anyway, patron Cherry says, I found Jess's takes at the reunion very differentiated and well put. I didn't find her manipulative or that her stance was too assertive or imposing. Yeah, I completely agree. And I pointed that out. I think that Jess, many times throughout the season, and particularly during the reunion, exhibited a high degree of differentiation, especially during the fights with Sarah. There was a pretty big contrast that you could tell among the cast, that there were some people that were prone to, no, you're a pick-me girl. Actually, I think Jess might have been one of those people. But at least there was somewhat of a difference where you had some people that were very barky and trying to dominate and yelly and accusatory. And then there were some people, in my head, it was AD and Jessica, who were much more likely to say, well, I'll wait for you to finish and then I'm going to calmly make my case. It's differentiation. Stephanie says, everyone needs to stop with the fake eyelashes. Yeah, I heard this too. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it. Simone says, I appreciate the kindness and openness everybody tried to show in the end. Yeah, this is kind of a hot take, but I agree with it. There seemed to be a lot, and maybe more so this season than in others, a lot of kindness and openness to each other. Melanie says, I think the Botox and the fillers and the hair extensions were too much. Okay, I don't know what to say about that. Mackenzie says, if Chelsea was a man, most people on the internet would be calling her abusive. Yeah, I've already been over that. Sandy says, this season was so good. That's my hot take. I loved seeing the anxious side of Chelsea because it reminds me of my worst behaviors, and she helped me to self-reflect. Yeah, Sandy, I think that's a great take, and I commend you for having it. Charlotte, because it's one thing to point the finger, it's another thing to point the finger. Anonymous YouTuber says, Charlotte was wild. I think there were more truthful moments in this season than almost any other. Now, when I read this hot take earlier, I was like, huh? And then I thought, well, yeah, actually, when you look at, like Clay's parents, Clay himself, Clay and Brett, when you look at Chelsea, when you look at, I guess, Jessica, there's a lot of authenticity there. And I will commend them for that. And yeah, we might say that has something to do with the culture of Charlotte. I don't know. Woman of Kales says, I don't think Trevor is a bad person. I just think he didn't want to end. So this one was the one hot take, I think, that was in line with an hypothesis. I don't know about Trevor. He could be the way that people think he is. But I do think it's important to emphasize the possibility that there is a very sympathetic, not a completely sympathetic, but a somewhat, or at least a more sympathetic narrative. And Woman of Kales was the only person on the survey out of almost 600 people that agreed with this before I said it, right? Because while I'm recording this, I have yet to release that episode where I'm watching the reunion. So Women of Kales, without hearing about my opinion, not that people would be influenced by it, but because, if I had stated that opinion and Women of Kales could say this because they're like, well, because Kirk agrees, so I'll agree with him. But Woman of Kales says, I don't think Trevor is a bad person. I just think he didn't want to end up alone. He wasn't ready to break it off with his girlfriend, but he convinced her he was going on the show for clout, even though that wasn't really what he was going on the show for. Because truly, I believe he wanted to see if the grass was greener on the other side. He isn't a bad person. He's just cowardly. But I feel like we've all been there at some point. Oh, so Women of Kales say, yeah, we've all been there at some point. And I like this take because it very concisely brings a lot of things together, including an idea that I hadn't really thought of in that way of cowardliness. That's not a word that I would use, but I think it, in terms of the usage here, I think it is potentially appropriate. And I think he would agree, honestly. I think he would say, I don't have the strength, or I'm too afraid to be alone, or I'm too afraid to make that leap. And I talked about that during the reunion, that for some people, due to their traumas, and really it's common for a lot of people, even without significant traumas, that when all indications are pointing in the direction of, I need to break up with this person. This is never going to work. And yet people will not break up. They'll let it string along, or they'll enter into this weird phase of a relationship where they're not really together, but they are. And it's largely because of being a coward. Again, I wouldn't use that word, but fear of being alone. That's what she is saying is, I just think he didn't want to end up alone. And it did have that look to it. And I said this during the reunion, that if this is a lie, this is a very strange lie that he would make, because there's so many other lies that we've seen that people will have. And I think I talked about Big Ed and Liz and Rose and the text and stuff, and how Ed just said that never happened. That's usually what people will do. And it's hard to refute, especially live on television. You might be able to refute it later, but you can't refute it necessarily in the moment, because people don't come prepared with their receipts, And so he could have easily said, she's lying. Jeremy, I think, was essentially saying that. Well, at the very least, he would have to refute the texts, completely. He'd be like, those are photoshopped. Yeah, I don't want to get into it, but I knew her in the past. Think Uche. He had some of that reactivity, and he wasn't even close to being in the same hot seat that Trevor was, So there's just because someone is a bad liar doesn't mean that they aren't lying. Also, if someone was particularly good at lying, they might be able to lie in a way that would at least get some people like myself to believe them. It could have been a strategy, or it could have been a strategy that he thought would work more widely but didn't work very well. So I don't know. But it's just nice to get to the bottom of the hot takes and to land on one. I'm not trying to defend Trevor so much as I guess I'm just trying to not feel like I'm a crazy person for at least having that possibility in my mind. But as I said in that video, I asked everyone to comment and upvote and stuff. So by the time this video comes out, I will have already read those comments. And so I'm guessing that some people will think similarly to Woman of Kales, but who knows? All right, well, that's my review of the survey. Tune in next time when I do my final thoughts. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.